Order! Order in the court! Today we have on trial Mr. Video Games. Mr. Video Games has been charged with multiple accounts of influencing heinous crimes, including theft, assault, armed robbery, and even murder. But does the prosecution have any proof? As all of you know, every criminal has a reason for committing his crime. There's always a purpose, there's always an intention, and there's always a cause. The cause for crime has been traced to various roots, whether it be poor parenting, social rejection, or even past trauma. We all know there must be something to blame. Ever since the introduction of them, violent video games have been the poster child of blame in regard to crimes among the youth. In fact, the former president, Donald J. Trump, who I will not be doing an impression of, publicly stated, "We must stop the glorification of violence in our society." This includes the gruesome and grisly video games that are now commonplace. It is too easy today for troubled youth to surround themselves with a culture that celebrates violence. We must stop or substantially reduce this, and it has to begin immediately. Do accusations such as these hold any water? Today, I will argue there's no proof that violent video games directly cause real-life violence in the US because of statistical evidence, coincidence, and inconclusive studies. To begin our discussion, we're going to take a look at some basic statistics on video games as well as on crime. Violent video games themselves really did not become prevalent until the early 90s with the release of Mortal Kombat, as well as a few other big names in the violent video game market. Video games featuring prevalent violence have continued to be released ever since 1990. Still then, video game releases and sales have been going steadily upward and then dropping off around 2010 with mobile gaming and those kind of additions. Now, if violent video games were the cause of violence and crime, then crime rates would be expected to spike around the same time. However, this is not what happens at all. According to an article by former New Orleans crime analyst Jeff Asher, since hitting a peak in 1990, murder rates in the US have gone way down. And this isn't just murder. Rape, robbery, assault, and murder were all down by over 30% from 1991 to 2016. So, from the data, it seems that video games don't negatively affect the US society as a whole. Second, I want to emphasize the fact that the correlations we see between violent video games and real-life violence are often sheer coincidence. While the previous statistics may be promising as a general rule for the whole of society, they say nothing about individuals who may be affected, nor do they shed the light on the fact, despite the decrease of overall murder, gun crime and mass shootings are on the increase. Therefore, we must investigate these more specific incidents and see if there's any evidence that leads us to believe that violent video games have caused individuals to turn into violent gunmen. The best way to do this is to look at cases of mass shootings. Not only are these crimes more individualized, but they also involve much gun violence, which seems to be the main complaint against violent video games. In fact, it seems to be much more reasonable of an argument to say that these select individuals' actions have been caused by violent video games rather than our entire society of youth. After some research, here's what I found. Some mass shooters, such as the 2 Columbine shooters, as well as the Sandy Hook Elementary shooter, played multiple violent video games. A more recent example comes from the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. For those of you who don't know, Rittenhouse is a young man currently on trial for firing upon rioters last year. He claims he shot in self-defense. After stating he bought the AR-15 because it looked cool in comparison to other guns he could have chosen, the prosecution then questioned Mr. Rittenhouse, asking if it resembled the types of weapons used in first-person shooter video games. Rittenhouse confessed that while he had played first-person shooters before, he does not play them often. The mass shooters were obviously fans of violent video games. Even Rittenhouse confessed to playing at least some violent video games. This possible evidence is not as conclusive as many seem to believe. Many mass shooters do not have a strong connection to violent video games. In fact, in 2002, the Secret Service themselves stated that only 12% of school shooters showed any interest in violent video games at all. Even if we ignore this fact, there's still a huge problem with blaming violent video games for a shooter's actions. According to an article found on Pew Research Center, 72% of men 18 to 29 play video games. So do 58% of men 30 to 49. Most mass shootings are committed by young men. Most young men play video games. It is just not all that stunning that mass shooters would share a quality found in most young men. In fact, most murderers wear clothing. Do you wear clothing? I do not necessarily say this for a laugh, but rather to show the poor argument against video games and other media that is held by the public. Lastly, we will look at scientific studies on video games. You may have even heard of some conclusive evidence against my point. The problem with these studies is that there are an incredibly vast number of them, with all of their evidence conflicting. Even when there is an article that shows a correlation between real violence and violent video games, it is normally such a small correlation that it is worthless. And I'm not even considering the many possible biases among each of these sources. In conclusion, we can see there is no evidence that violent video games directly affect real-life violence. It seems to me that we so desire to have something to blame, anything to blame, as long as it is convenient for us. There are so many real issues that cause people to become violent, but we blame it on a game. It is so sad that while we waste our energy on getting rid of video games, bullying, abusive parents, mental illness, PTSD, and a multitude of other possible causes are ignored. Fellow students, when looking for a solution to serious problems such as violence, instead of taking away troubled people's ways of escape, let's listen to their problems, hear them, and love them as Christ has loved us.